What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys. In today's video, we're going to be going over the top wide receiver trade targets heading into Week 10. With it being Week 10, that means this may be the last opportunity we have in sending trade offers out for the remainder of the season. So you'll notice a common theme with every player we have listed as a buy this week. For example, you'll notice each one that we are suggesting you buy is virtually a top 25 player. That means we are projecting them to be starters for you in the playoffs. On top of that, we did put an added emphasis and focus on making sure that they do have solid playoff schedules as well. Not all of these players are going to technically be buy lows, but with it being one of our last opportunities to submit trades, we want to make sure we're targeting the correct players regardless if we're buying low on them or not. Before we do get into the video though, just a quick shout out and reminder that if you do enjoy these videos, the best way to show your support is simply by hitting that like button. Each like of course goes a long way in helping us grow the channel, so each of you that do like this video, it is greatly appreciated. With that being said though, it's time to hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which running back has seen the highest rate of 8+ defenders in the box this season. The correct answer was actually Mark Ingram. Congratulations to Ross Michael, the first to get this right on YouTube, and as for Twitter, at brich1982. Once again, congratulations to both of you, but as for today's stat of the day, which running back with at least 100 rush attempts has spent the most time behind the line of scrimmage? Once again, that's which running back with at least 100 rush attempts has had the most time spent behind the line of scrimmage. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, now without further ado, let's hop right into it, and as per usual, we'll begin with the players that we have listed as buys this week. And of course, we'll start off with the player listed on the thumbnail. It's Diontae Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. One of the best parts about targeting Diontae Johnson this week is that you technically are buying low on him. His last game, of course, being against the Chicago Bears this past Monday night, and in that game, he only received 6 targets, put up less than 60 receiving yards. And if you're really diving into his production, you'll realize he hasn't scored a receiving touchdown since all the way back in Week 5. On the season, he currently stands as the wide receiver 25 in both PPR and standard, and while you'll likely have to pay more than a wide receiver 25 price tag in order to nab him on your team, I don't believe the owners of Diontae Johnson are going to ask anything near a wide receiver 1 price. When it comes to Diontae Johnson specifically, we know the wide receivers around him have been falling off due to injury. Juju Smith-Schuster several weeks ago was ruled out for the entire season, and now Chase Claypool is even listed as week to week. So Diontae Johnson, a player who had been receiving 10+ targets in nearly every game this season, his floor is just going to be that much higher week to week, but his ceiling's also going to increase as well. If that wasn't enough reason to buy into Diontae, you should also be aware that he has one of the best schedules for the remainder of the season, including one of the best playoff schedules we could possibly ask for. Even looking at next week, he faces the Detroit Lions, a very beatable pass defense, and following that week, he does have a less than ideal matchup against the LA Chargers. But from week 12 on, he has all plus matchups, starting with Cincinnati, then going into Baltimore. Then in week 14, he has a matchup on the road against Minnesota, week 15 against Tennessee, 16 against Kansas City, and 17 against Cleveland. With 18 weeks this season, most of us do have our fantasy championships in week 17. That means for most of us, our playoffs are from weeks 15 to week 17. Looking specifically at Diontae's schedule through that span, he has week 15 against Tennessee, 16 against Kansas City, 17 against Cleveland. And when it comes to fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, Kansas City and Cleveland rank inside the top 12, so very juicy matchups. But even better, when looking at Tennessee, they're the #1 team at allowing fantasy points to the wide receiver position. There are few targets at the wide receiver position that have the combination of great playoff schedule with a cheap price tag, players that you can actually buy low on right now, that also have the combination of being difference makers for you in the playoffs. Diontae Johnson brings the unique package that combines all of those things, and with now the team being without Chase Claypool listed as week to week, the opportunity and upside for him is going to be that much greater. Moving into the next buy low wide receiver we have, it's Brandin Cooks of the Houston Texans. If you're looking for a player that could not only help you in the playoffs, but could even help you get there if maybe you're a struggling team, look no further than Brandin Cooks, who's also a player that you could technically be buying low on. In week 9, he was only able to put up 11.6 PPR fantasy points, and that was in a very beatable matchup against the Miami Dolphins. Then on top of that, he's currently facing a bye week in week 10, so fantasy owners of Brandin Cooks who may be struggling themselves right now may be forced or in a situation where they need to trade him away in order to secure a win this week. Because he is currently on a bye week and coming off a game where he posted less than 12 fantasy points, I don't believe the cost you're going to have to pay to get to him is going to be anything near what he's going to return for your team in production for the remainder of the season. He has an incredible schedule. Immediately following the bye, he gets a matchup against Tennessee. We had just mentioned they allow the most fantasy points to wide receivers, but in week 12 he gets the Jets, week 13 the Indianapolis Colts, and follows that up in weeks 14 and 15 in games against Seattle and Jacksonville. In those games, it's not a stretch whatsoever to assume Brandin Cooks has wide receiver 1 upside, and in the first game we saw with Tyrod Taylor, Brandin Cooks received a whopping 14 targets. In addition to that, with Tyrod Taylor now returning for this team, I think that opens up the door for more scoring opportunities as a whole. More sustained drives for this offense as well, which will ultimately lead to more snaps, more passing volume, all factors ultimately going to help Brandin Cooks. Now currently, he is the wide receiver 14 in PPR leagues, so in order to nab him, you are going to have to pay up, but as mentioned, since he's coming off of one of his worst performances, coupled with the fact that he is now on a bye week for week 10, even though he won't be the cheapest receiver you could possibly target, you'll definitely be getting him at a good value this week. Alright guys, if you're looking for a wide receiver to provide you a bit more upside, that potential player that you could trade for now but could be a wide receiver 1 for the remainder of the year, look no further than Ceedee Lamb, who's currently sitting as the wide receiver 17 in PPR leagues. One of the best parts about targeting Ceedee Lamb this week is that he is coming off of one of his worst performances of the year, week 9 against the Denver Broncos. While receiving 9 targets, he was only able to catch 2 of them, ultimately putting up 23 receiving yards. Definitely a bust week. He only put up 4.3 points in a PPR format, but with matchups in week 10 and 11 versus Atlanta and Kansas City, it's very likely he will turn from the wide receiver 17 where he currently stands back into a mid to low end wide receiver 1. One of the main reasons we're targeting Ceedee Lamb and why we like him so much is A, his schedule for the remainder of the year, but also B, he provides a ceiling that few wide receivers in the league are able to match. Few receivers in the entire league have put up 20 plus fantasy points, let alone 30 plus, and Ceedee Lamb has already had a game this season in which he put up over 36 fantasy points, and with Ceedee Lamb having matchups against the Washington football team 2 times between weeks 14 through 17, also a matchup against the New York Giants, his ceiling is going to be astronomical. Looking at those matchups against Washington specifically, a team that's allowed the second most fantasy points to wide receivers on the year. Trading for Ceedee Lamb, it's not going to come cheap, but when it comes to a better time to target him, sending an offer for him after he's posted under 5 fantasy points last week, this could possibly be the best time of the entire season to have sent out an offer for him whatsoever. Now moving into the next player, this target is going to be for some of you out there that don't have a lot of trade capital, maybe not a lot of excess players you could sell high on. In that case, I think a good bargain bin player that could possibly crack your starting lineup in the fantasy playoffs definitely has to be Kadarius Toney of the New York Giants. If you're going to send out offers for Kadarius Toney, you know you aren't going to have to pay even a fraction of the price you would for some of the other receivers in this video. Toney himself being a player that many people picked up off the waiver wire, and even looking at his recent production, he hasn't posted double-digit fantasy points since all the way back in week 5. When you also factor in that Week 10 is going to be the New York Giants bye week, Kadarius Toney makes an extremely cheap trade target, one you could possibly even find making his way to waivers by desperate teams. As mentioned, we still do value him as a top 35 wide receiver for the remainder of the year. He also has a very juicy schedule in many matchups moving forward, starting as early as week 11 against Tampa Bay, then looking to week 13 against Miami, week 15 against Dallas, which was actually the game in which he posted nearly 30 fantasy points. Then rounding out in the fantasy championship, week 17, he faces the Chicago Bears, a team that on the season has allowed the 6th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. As mentioned, we didn't want to include anybody we didn't think could crack your starting lineup in the fantasy playoffs, and Kadarius Toney, he just barely makes the cut, but somebody you could get really cheap that could be a true difference maker down the stretch. For those of you looking for a high upside option mention those of you that do have the excess budget, I am going to quickly shout out Davante Adams, and while I don't have to spend all that much time on him, you guys already know he's a top 3 wide receiver for the remainder of the year, but with him coming off a game without Aaron Rodgers, a game in which he hardly posted double-digit fantasy points, then looking at the week before that, he posted 0 points as well. So although you are going to have to pay a hefty price tag to get him, I do think if there ever was a time that owners of Davante Adams would be willing to trade him, this would definitely be the time to act. Alright guys, now it's time to move over to our sell high wide receivers, and at the top of the list, I'm going to include both of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receivers, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. On the season, anyone that owns either Chris Godwin or Mike Evans has been paid dividends for their investment in the draft. Heading into their bye week, both wide receivers in both PPR and standard were ranking within the top 10. Neither one of them has busted in several weeks, while also being able to show off their ceiling, with neither of them strangers to posting 20 plus fantasy points in any given matchup. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that their production will completely fall off a cliff, but largely the reason I am saying to sell them is because these are the types of players that you can actually use as trade chips to get some of the buy low wide receivers I had mentioned earlier. As mentioned, heading into their bye, each one of them was ranking within the top 10. My main concern, of course, does come down to Antonio Brown, who recently shed his walking boot. And while Antonio Brown may not be a death sentence for either of these two receivers, we know when all three were on the field, Antonio Brown out of all three of them was the one frequently having the best game of the three. With us not having seen him since week 6, it's easy for us to forget exactly how disappointing both Chris Godwin and Mike Evans were in several matchups while Antonio Brown was on the field. But you'll be reminded once again, Antonio Brown is going to return before you know it. Remember, the team was reluctant to put him on IR, and with the recent news he shed his walking boot, I would expect he's going to play within the next week or so. Trading Evans and Godwin now while their fantasy value is near its highest is one way you can capitalize on their recent success and turn it into something greater for you in the future. The next player we have listed on the sell list isn't necessarily a player that you're selling high on. It's Terry McLaurin of the Washington football team. Terry McLaurin is now coming off of his bye week, and the week before that was a matchup against Denver in which he only had 3 receptions for 23 yards, posting his worst performance of the season. One of the positive things about Terry McLaurin coming off of a poor performance in a bye week, now heading into a matchup against Tampa Bay, one of the better matchups you could possibly ask for, means potential trade partners are going to be targeting him specifically as a buy low wide receiver who coming off the bye week is heading into a great matchup, who moving forward may even get a quarterback upgrade, going from Taylor Heineke to potentially Ryan Fitzpatrick. Altogether, that means that Terry McLaurin will be a highly sought after player and one that will be on a lot of people's trade target list. So for those of you that own McLaurin, this is something you can take full advantage of. The reason though that we are suggesting you trade him away now is because we aren't so hopeful of Terry McLaurin's production for the remainder of the year. On the season, he's been a top 15 wide receiver, but 3 of his last 4 contests have resulted in single-digit performances. If you're able to trade Terry McLaurin away, get back-end wide receiver 1 value for him, we not only think that is a good deal in exchange for him, but we also think that's more than he will provide for your team for the remainder of the year. But if the trade partners that you are making deals with are trying to lowball you, offering you a mid to back-end wide receiver 2 price for him in a trade, then obviously we don't condone you trading him, at least not for that price. But if you do find a reasonable trade partner, which you shouldn't have too much difficulty doing, Terry McLaurin is a player that does have the combination of name value coupled with factors that could lead to increased production through the second half of the year. Our outlook for him, it's not so bright. For that reason, we definitely think he would be near the top of the list in players we think you should trade away, even though you aren't going to be trading him at maximum value. And unfortunately, we do have the same case with our final wide receiver in this video. It's obviously been one you've heard for several weeks, DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals. As we all know, people are going to be making last-ditch efforts in order to get players on their team that could potentially carry them in the playoffs. Few wide receiver trade targets in the entire league are going to be as alluring to your opponents as DeAndre Hopkins would in a trade. DeAndre Hopkins is going to be a player on many people's fantasy boards, and I've seen him on many buy low fantasy lists as we inch into the trade deadline. Currently on the season, DeAndre Hopkins is the wide receiver 19. That was on the back of him not playing in week 9 against San Francisco. But excluding that fact, he's basically been a back-end wide receiver 1 for this entire year. Now, all of that production was largely on the back of his touchdowns. Last season, while DeAndre Hopkins was getting double-digit targets in nearly every game, this season for 2021, DeAndre Hopkins has yet to have a single game in which he's had double-digit targets. As we know, the Arizona Cardinals offense is one of the better ones we have in the entire league, but any player that relies solely off their touchdown production to maintain their status as a wide receiver 1, it's a risky player to bet on to maintain that production for the remainder of the year, and it's a house of cards that could crumble at any time. With Kyler Murray now dealing with an injury and missing last game, this could ultimately be a factor that holds back this offense from producing the way that it was in the first half of the season. We know last season when Kyler Murray did suffer an injury around this time last year, his production fell off and DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy output was nothing like it was through the first half. Now, I'm not saying for certain that is what's going to happen to DeAndre Hopkins, but I do know that his name value alone means you could get virtually any wide receiver or any running back in a trade as long as you pair in the right complementary pieces to go along with it, and that's a rare quality of any players that we own, knowing with this player we can go after nearly any potential trade target in the league. Obviously, I'm not saying to sell DeAndre Hopkins low and only ask for back-end wide receiver 2 value from him, but I think there are many potential trade partners in your league that will not only be willing to pay you back-end wide receiver 1 value for him, but maybe even mid-grade wide receiver 1 value as well. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.